Welcome everyone to our kickoff panel of the annual GZERO Summit. The focus of this session is geopolitics of post-Cold War, Corona world. Although we're still deeply in a crisis of this global pandemic, we'd like to step back a little bit and explore the impact on the world order in 2021 and beyond. For that, we're lucky to have an amazing panel here today from both sides of the Pacific. With Mr. Ian Bremmer, President of Eurasia Group, Ms. Jane Harman, former US Congresswoman from California and current President of Wilson Center, Mr. Taro Kono, Minister in charge of Administrative and Regulatory Reform. He's previously served as Foreign Minister and Defense Minister for the government of Japan. Mr. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia and current President of Asia Society Policy Institute. And I am Junko Tanaka with NHK Japan Broadcasting. Again, it's great to have you all, and let's get right into it, if I may. First of all, I would like to ask each of you to give us the context of how you view the geopolitical implication of the pandemic and the evolution of post-Corona world order. Starting with Mr. Bremmer, I heard your opening remarks several minutes ago, and if I understand it correctly, you see the pandemic as an accelerator of the GZERO world. Could you expand on that? And also, are there winners and losers coming out of this pandemic?
Sure. The structural inequality that we've seen around the world is growing because coronavirus hits those that are disenfranchised so much worse. The lack of trust between the United States and China has gotten accelerated over coronavirus, given the lack of cooperation and coordination, whether you talk about the vaccine or supply chains and the rest. But when you mention winners and losers, maybe I'd say three very quick things. One thing, the United States is a winner in terms of its hard power. The importance of America's technology companies is never been as important as getting the United States through coronavirus and in positioning the American economy as a consequence. The role of America's banks, much stronger in this environment than those of other countries around the world. The role of the US dollar as global reserve currency. And yet the United States today stands as by far the single most politically divided advanced industrial democracy in the world, with its institutions continuing to erode. So a dynamic between the two that makes it hard to say, is America a winner or a loser? So too China. China's the one major economy that's gotten through coronavirus. This year, their economy is growing, and their ability to engage in quarantine and surveillance to defeat the virus once they admitted to its existence is beyond that of any major economy in the world. And yet the level of mistrust of China has grown dramatically. Even as President Trump has been president, many countries haven't trusted that, but they trust the Chinese even less. And so a real push and pull between whether China's a winner or China's a loser coming out of coronavirus. And then you can talk about Germany and Japan, countries that don't have the anti-establishment sentiment domestically, whose social safety net is much more functional, whose sense of political legitimacy is much greater, who stand for multilateralism and rule of law, yet both of whom are going through political transitions that will see the end of the most powerful leaders both countries have had in decades. In the case of Prime Minister Abe in Japan, in the case of Chancellor Merkel in Germany. And while I expect both of those transitions will be extremely smooth, still, it means that the ability of both countries to act in ways that will influence the global order to a greater degree is going to take some time. So 2021, from that perspective, feels like a very, very deeply transitional year. And it's a little early for me to talk about who the winners and losers are.
Excellent. Mr. Kono, how do you see the evolving geopolitics from Japan's point of view? And what will be the geopolitical priorities for Suga government going forward?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm so used to doing a meeting online. I'm wondering what we're going to do after COVID-19. Are we going to physically get together to have international meeting? Or are we going to continue online meeting? Well, anyway, 2021, we need to be very carefully monitoring the United States intention. If U.S. is again trying to take a leadership in building a coalition among the like-minded country, coalition to sustain democracy, coalition to protect global rule, and trying to protect the liberal international order that has brought about this economic prosperity after the World War II. And is United States trying to recreate a global trade regime? Is US coming back to WTO? Is US joining TPP, hopefully? And I guess after COVID-19, we need to create a new exception to WTO rules. If it's important for security, we should be allowed to produce important material, important product domestically. So we need to create some kind of exception to WTO rules. So how are we going to build up this talks on new trade rule? I think that's going to be very important. And the Suga government declared that we're going to achieve carbon neutral by 2050. Previously, the Japanese government was very hesitating to make declaration or make a target. Now we are openly trying to achieve carbon neutral by 2050. That means we're going to bring in more investment into the renewable, and we will try to get rid of coal. We will stop exporting coal power plant and all those things. So it's going to be a very drastic change in industrial policy. I think that'll be the number one global priority for Suga government. And I think we need to build a stronger alliance between United States and Japan, between the two new regimes. So it's going to be a very interesting year, 2021. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harman, Minister Kono just described very high expectation for the incoming Biden administration. Do you think that's realistic? Can you, your country, meet the expectation?
Well, let me say first how pleased I am to participate in the GZERO Summit. I am in Los Angeles. You can see palm trees out there, which is ground zero for COVID-19. That's not the same thing as GZERO, Ian. And I also want to tell you what a high honor I think it is for the GZERO Summit that Prime Minister Suga gave the opening remarks. That's a big deal, and they were very interesting. And the answer to your question is it's too early to know the answer to your question. The reason it's too early to know the answer to your question is, first of all, that President-elect Biden, who is the most experienced foreign policy president since President Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, is putting together his cabinet. He's made some very good moves, in my view, especially the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and several others, but he doesn't have it all put together. And obviously, these people are also not confirmed. He hasn't taken power yet. Secondly, there is a very important runoff election in Georgia on January 5th, the day before the new Congress is sworn in. And that will determine which party, which of our political parties, is in control of the United States Senate. And that makes a very big difference to what Biden could possibly accomplish. If the Senate remains in Republican hands and Mitch McConnell remains the majority leader of the Senate, I would predict gridlock continues to a great extent for two reasons. Number one, it turns out that gridlock is a good election strategy. To my horror, it's a good election strategy. But number two, President Trump will not go quietly into the night, and he will continue to insist, I think, that the election was stolen and so forth, and to undermine the ability of our Congress to do anything. Now, why does that matter? Because President-elect Biden can govern as President Trump did by executive order, things that he can do within his Article 2 power under our Constitution. But it is the Congress of the United States that appropriates the funds and that sets the big directions. And if Congress can't do anything, Biden's agenda will be hobbled. Last comment. I was interested to see that President Suga's agenda is very similar to the agenda that President Biden talks about. So if both sides can get momentum, there is a very good strategy for renewed cooperation between the United States and Japan, and I am all for renewed cooperation between our countries.
Thank you. Mr. Rudd, what is your take on the geopolitical impact of the pandemic, especially in Asia-Pacific region?
Good. Thank you for the invitation to speak. And good to join Ian and Taro and Jane and others. And Taro, the decision by the Japanese government to go for carbon neutrality by mid-century is a really important strategic decision. And so on behalf of those of us who follow this debate closely around the world, it's been important. It's helped build momentum. The Europeans have done. You've created momentum also for what President Biden is committed to do. It's been instrumental, I think, in causing the Chinese to go towards mid-century carbon neutrality, albeit in their case by 2060. So congratulations to the Japanese government. Three questions in response to the impact of COVID on the Asia-Pacific Security Order, or the Asia-Pacific region more generally. One is China, as in the rest of the world, took a big reputational hit because the virus came from Wuhan. And you don't have to be either in Berlin or in Bangor to work that out. Secondly, China's attempt to use the distribution of PPE around Asia and the rest of the world as a tool of diplomacy effectively backfired because China insisted on public statements of loyalty to the imperial throne as a precondition for the delivery of PPE. This was received negatively around the world. Thirdly, there's an open question, though, about what China is now doing with the distribution of the Chinese vaccine. And whereas both the British and the Americans are largely focused on their domestic populations and saving them through their own vaccine development and distribution, the Chinese vaccine is now being distributed in many regions around the world. My most recent example is what's happening in the Gulf states and the Gulf monarchies. But there is a level of vaccine diplomacy below the radar by China at present, which I think the United States and the Europeans, I cannot speak for the Japanese, may be not fully aware of. And there's an open question as to whether Chinese, through this exercise, will make up for much of the damage that came out of exercises 1 and 2, origin of the virus and the PPE question. We need to therefore follow that one particularly closely. The second point is to back up what Taro said before. The bottom line is the ball is very much now in America's court about what it wishes to do in the region and the world. We understand, as American friends and allies, divided government. We understand the nature of the United States Congress. As foreign barbarians who have dealt with the Americans for such a long period of time, we've had to become experts in American domestic politics. So we take all that as a given. However, it doesn't give you an excuse, you in the United States, our great and powerful friends, on the core question of whether you will be resuming short-term or long-term your regional and global leadership role across all dimensions. I agree fully with Jane. There is a grave danger that people underestimate the capability and capacity of President-elect Biden and the team that he has assembled. I think this will be as formidable a foreign policy and national security team as assembled by President Truman after the war. And the Truman administration was much underestimated by the rest of the world. And so therefore, as Ian has said, the jury is still out in terms of whether COVID-19 accelerates the geopolitical transition which has been underway before. The variable here is US policy and strategy. And the variable here is whether policy and strategy is sustained beyond the 4-year point in terms of a long-term return to American regional and global leadership role. So therefore, that's the variable in this. But finally, there's a third factor as well, which is the Chinese. We often assume that the Chinese are on an inevitable trajectory to greater and greater power. My word of caution about that is those of us who look forensically at the Chinese economy should understand that it too has been under enormous domestic stress and challenge, not just because of COVID, but for two other reasons. There is a division of opinion in the Chinese economic policy establishment about the competing pressures of economic self-reliance in China versus the continued push towards globalization. And there is as yet an unconcluded internal debate on that question. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, there is an internal debate becoming more intense on the proper future role of the Chinese private sector and the degree of party interference in the future role of the private sector. The private sector for the last 20 years has caused China to become the great global economy that it's become, not the Chinese public sector, not the Chinese state and enterprise sector. It's been the private sector. It's grown Chinese demand, it has grown the economy, it has grown income levels, all the employment growth in China has come out of the private sector. But for those of us who follow this closely, the recent experience of Ant Financial and its failed float and the direct interference by the Chinese Communist Party and by the Chinese government to prevent that float from proceeding is a classic case study of the internal tensions in the China domestic economic model. So we can assume that everything is fine and dandy for the Chinese and it's one perfect linear development towards greater and greater power. That is an intelligent and pragmatic assumption for the rest of us. But we should also understand, however, that the drivers of China's long-term economic power are also under deep challenge from this lack of resolution on these two core questions within the Chinese domestic policy debate. I'll leave my remarks there.
Thank you very much. Very interesting insight on China. And we'll come back to the issue of China later. But let me focus on Biden's victory for now. Mr. Bremmer, in your view, is incoming President Biden reversing the foreign policy of President Trump? Or is it going to be basically the same with a little more nuance? And how do you see the prospect of populism and Trumpism as a political force in the US and around the world?
The populism and Trumpism is a constraint. It means that a lot of Americans are unwilling to support candidates and policies that promote U.S. global interests, that promote free trade. Remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership that our friend Taro Kono suggested, love to see the U.S. go back, failed under Obama and Biden. Then Trump removed the U.S. from further negotiations, and I am think it's highly unlikely that Biden would try to bring the U.S. back, not because he doesn't want to. He wants to. He supports the deal. But there isn't support for it in his own party. There isn't support for it in the United States. And the same thing is true if you look at American troops all over the world. Hillary Clinton supported the Afghan surge. Biden opposed it. But the population increasingly opposes it. And it's going to be very difficult, given the need for more spending, but also Republicans that suddenly rediscover fiscal austerity and accountability. The idea that we're going to do more defense spending under a Biden administration is going to be really challenged. So I think there's less willingness of the United States to be the global sheriff. And in terms of the United States promoting democracy all over the world, I mean, I just saw Secretary of State Pompeo criticizing Myanmar and Tanzania and the Cote d'Ivoire for irregularities in their elections. I think it's pretty clear that no one around the world wants to hear the United States talk about your own political problems domestically. No one internationally would look at the US and say they want their political system to run like that. You might say that about Canada. You might say it about Japan or about Germany or the Nordic companies. No one would say it about the United States. And it's painful, but it's true. And all of those realities inform Biden's foreign policy. But there's another even more important reality, and that is that President-elect Biden takes office in the middle of the worst crisis of our lifetimes, and not just the worst crisis globally, but also the worst crisis right here in the United States. And you wouldn't know it by looking at the markets, but you would by talking to the average American. And you would by looking at the probably 500,000 Americans dead by January 20th, the inauguration. And Biden must prioritize in 2021 his response to coronavirus. That needs to be number one, number two, and number three. If he gets it wrong, it destroys his presidency. And that most importantly means the rollout of the vaccine. Now, the good news is American vaccines right now and the general development of vaccines looks better than any epidemiologist could have dared to hope 6 months ago, even 2 months ago. But the United States, whether or not the United States in 2021 is going to be the world leader in producing and rolling out vaccines, or fails as badly as the US has failed in terms of healthcare in the last 10 months, is an open question. We don't yet know. I mean, the production of these Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, the new technology, unprecedented. The ability to get them rolled out across the United States, given the infrastructure needs and the different capacities of different red and blue states, unprecedented. The willingness of Americans to take these vaccines, the level of disinformation around the anti-vax sentiment, unprecedented. We just don't know. If they do it well, not only will the United States by May, June have vaccinated most of the American population, but we'll be in a position to export, and to export the world's best vaccines, the ones that really work at 95% efficacy, better than the Chinese vaccine. If we fail, then not only will the United States be incredibly angry and will Biden's approval ratings tank, but we'll also be failing to China's vaccine nationalism around the world that Kevin just spoke about, which is incredibly important and likely to be more successful than their failed attempts at spreading PPE, for example. So much to play for as we think about Biden becoming president in 2021. And I got to tell you, not a position many of us would want to see ourselves in. The challenges are incredible. And let's remember Biden's 78. It's going to be a tough year.
Well, Ms. Harman, you explained about the complexity of the U.S. domestic politics and how it will be a variable for Biden's ability to govern. But if you could explain to us a little bit more, where are the establishments in the Republican Party? Is Republican Party continue to be Trump's party going forward?
Okay, well, first let me say that if I weren't an optimist, there's no way I could have served 9 terms in the United States Congress. So I think Ian's a little pessimistic, and I think the American private sector in particular, which has developed these vaccines, is amazing. Let's celebrate American innovation. I mean, with collaboration with some foreign partners, but nonetheless, American firms. And they developed the vaccine, distributing it is harder. But I don't think I think that will happen. And I think the Biden administration is experienced, and the team, not just the foreign policy team, but the economic policy team is experienced, and this is going to happen. So you asked about the Republican Party. Well, it's a dirty little secret that each of our parties over the years, our Republican and Democratic parties, is 2 parties. The Democratic Party has a far left wing, which is anti-trade, basically anti-globalization, basically isolationist in terms of the projection of American hard power, and for things like socialized health care. Those are not the things that the rest of the Democratic Party is for. I was in the rest of the Democratic Party, by the way, for better or worse. I am for trade, global engagement, and a variety of strategies to use the private sector, which is what we're seeing, the innovation in the private sector to deliver effective health care. So those are just a few things, and for an engaged foreign policy. Republican Party, same thing. There's a conservative, now kind of scary wing of the Republican Party, which is anti-trade, very populist, at the moment very pro-Trump, and then there's a moderate wing of the Republican Party. Think of it as a U, with the extremes at the end of the U and the centrists in the middle. Well, the middle isn't doing so well. So what's left of the Republican Party? Where are we going with this? I would say in the short term, not much, because I think Trump will retain a hold on a certain kind of power over 70 million people who voted for him. Not all like him very much, but they were persuaded for a variety of reasons that the alternative was worse. But anyway, he will retain that hold. He has raised over $200 million in the last several weeks for his war chest, I would call it, from people who think that the election was stolen. And how he's going to use that is very unclear. Whether he'll spend any of it on the Georgia election, which would save the Republican majority in the Senate or not, is unclear. His messages in Georgia are unclear. So I think that he will dominate the more extreme wing of the Republican Party, and the party will not be able to rebuild in the short term. And the Democratic Party will be fractured as well. So the challenge for Biden will be to put the most experienced team, which has diversity and represents the broadest tent, including some Republicans, that would be my recommendation, to work on what he calls Build Back Better. First, deal with the coronavirus problem, which will take enormous work. Second, deal with the American economy. We will never have a successful foreign policy if we don't have a restored economy. And then third, use the coronavirus opportunity, this is my optimistic side, to help the rest of the world get over it too. And we will, by projecting that, we know how to do this. We solved Ebola in Africa, more or less. Jimmy Carter, after he left the presidency, solved guinea worm and river blindness in Africa, again, using our pharmaceutical might. And can we do this quickly? I don't know, but I'm actually optimistic that we have a way forward, and we will not let this crisis go to waste.
Thank you. I think we can talk all day about US politics, but maybe I should move to, I should bring in China factor now. Mr. Rudd, can you tell us what was the China's reaction to Biden victory, and what do you think is the prospect of US-China relations, especially the technology Cold War under Biden?
I think in Beijing there is a divided reaction to the election of Biden. The bottom line is that Chinese are ultimate strategic realists, and they will deal as effectively as they can with whichever president is elected. But the division of opinion in Beijing and the division of strategy is along these lines. One, they will welcome a Biden win for one core reason. They see a greater prospect of a re-stabilization of the US-China relationship on core questions of, shall we say, national security management in terms of crisis-creating incidents over Taiwan and the South China Sea. The problem which the Chinese began to experience in the last 6 months of the Trump administration was what they concluded to be an increasingly series of unpredictable and somewhat erratic actions by the Americans, particularly over Taiwan, not just militarily but politically, and the dispatch of cabinet-level representatives to Taipei on a series of visits. And the active fear in Beijing was that in the interregnum, the Trump administration would even contemplate the possibility of naval visits to Taiwan. If you know anything about Chinese central politics, playing around with the one China policy is inherently dangerous and creates a series of chemical reactions within Chinese politics, which the rest of us would find irrational, but that does not make them real, less real, I should say. So why do they welcome the Bidens at this level, the Biden administration? Is that they see a Biden administration not predisposed towards playing with fire over Taiwan, and possibly less predisposed towards being aggressive, as they would see it, in the South China Sea, but principally on the Taiwan question. So that's one point. On the second point, in terms of the Chinese reaction to the Biden administration, however, it is a much greater level of systemic concern. And the systemic concern is along these lines. One, Trump they liked because he was so damaging to the brand of democracy around the world. Two, Trump they liked because he was such a divisive influence in the maintenance of United States alliances around the world, particularly in Europe, but also in Asia, dealing with, for example, the South Koreans. Three, Trump, because of his inherent protectionism and isolationism, was walking away from pre-existing multilateral trade agreements and reflecting a systemic hostility to trade arrangements such as the TPP and now more recently RCEP. And four, that Trump had, because of his attitude to multilateralism in general, was one by one walking away from multilateral institutions in the UN sphere, creating a much greater, easier opportunity for China to walk in. And so the level of concern about the Biden administration in Beijing is that they see each of those courses of action now being put into reverse, and that the easy gains that China has had as a consequence of those four sets of measures will now not be as easy in the future as they have been in the past. I think the final point I'd say about Chinese perceptions and reactions to the Biden win is that there is a deep realism in Beijing about the seismic shift in US domestic politics towards China. This is not news to the Chinese. They have become experts in American domestic politics like the rest of us have had to become in recent decades. They follow, therefore, the opinion polling acutely. They know that there is no longer an effective public base of opinion poll support towards a return to the China relationship as it once was, and that therefore the future will not be simply a return to the past, but it'll be radically different. However, Chinese ultimately are of the view that the trend lines of history are moving in their direction, and that the inherent restraints and constraints and difficulties of divided government in the United States will prevent the United States from taking the fundamental national and international courses of policy action, which will ultimately stand in China's road from becoming the preeminent power in Asia. The job, of course, of the United States is to prove them wrong, and the job of American allies is to prove them wrong. But your question to me is, how do the Chinese perceive this? Looking carefully at the entrails of Chinese official documents in the last short period of time, and having continued to have a range of conversations with my Chinese interlocutors, that's my best summary of where I think Chinese sentiment about Biden is up to.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kono, I think Japan is in a unique position when it comes to US-China relations. President Trump adopted Japan's so-called FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy. However, Mr. Biden, in his phone call with Asian leaders, including Mr. Suga, is modifying the phrase from free and open to secure and prosperous. How do you see the implication?
Can't hear you.
I think you're on mute, Taro.
Okay, sorry. Hi, can you hear me now? I think we are watching China is challenging the liberal international order, and it's becoming some kind of, I could say, threat to the global rules. China practically devastated Hong Kong's two systems in one country and is now democracy in Taiwan under threat. So I think the global society need to make China pay high cost whenever they are trying to break the rules. And in order to do that, I think we need United States taking the leadership. During the Abe administration, Japan established very strong relationship with Europe. And now Europe is looking at China the way we see it. And we are very successfully bringing in new Quad with Australia, India, United States, and Japan. So we have been able to create a system to make the global system going again if United States is willing to. For last couple of years, in terms of security, I think Japan-US alliance has been very strong. But when it comes to the global system, the United States has not been a reliable partner. So Japan had to look for Europe, Australia, India, and others. And we need a linchpin in building free and open Indo-Pacific. I don't think under the Biden administration, the policy towards the free and open Indo-Pacific will not change. I think it is very important. But in order to create free and open Indo-Pacific, the alliance between Japan and the United States is not just enough. We need to bring in strong Quad. We need to have US part of TPP. TPP is not just a trade agreement. It is a rule-making body for new free and open Indo-Pacific. That's why Japan joined Obama administration to create the TPP, and President-elect Biden understand it very well. It is very unfortunate if the US doesn't support TPP and let TPP afloat. It'll be a very unfortunate situation. Then US, Japan need to look for other mechanism so that we can create a rule for the free and open Indo-Pacific. The military power of the United States alone is not enough. We need to bring in some kind of economic relationship. We need to provide alternative to Chinese market. We need to provide alternative to Chinese money investment. We need to provide alternative to Chinese military expansionism. And whatever we do, we need United States for free and open Indo-Pacific. So how we can work on American general public that need to bring about a free and open Indo-Pacific in order to counter Chinese military expansion, Chinese economic expansionism. United States need to work with the system. US need to work with the global system. And I hope the Republicans in the Congress, Republicans in the Senate, understand and agree with us to see there's no alternative to that.
Thank you. Mr. Bremmer, do you have a response to that? Do you think Biden administration will continue to adopt FOIP strategy, or are they thinking of something else?
Again, I do believe that the Biden administration incoming understands how important a broad pivot to Asia really is, implementing on one. They understand that China is their leading competitor. They understand that the broad parameters of much of the Trump administration's policies towards China, even if sloppily executed and not aligned with allies as well as it could have been, was nonetheless in the right direction. So I think there will be very similarities between Trump and Biden in terms of, say, Hong Kong position or South China Sea or the Quad, or how we think about 5G and Huawei and ZTE and technology and all of the rest. But, you know, we are right now not quite at the 50% point of dealing with this crisis, of getting through coronavirus. We're almost at the inflection point. It's still going to get worse in the United States before it gets better. We're just starting vaccines. We have to see what next year looks like to talk about what the US-China dynamic is going to be like. And even though I think that there's going to be consistency in a lot of US policies, and it's true that the United States and China have enormous amounts of economic interdependence that is supported by very strong vested interests in both the United States and China, and that will continue to be the case under the Biden administration too. So there's no Cold War today. There's not going to be a Cold War in 1 or 2 years. But there are two areas that really do deserve focus. One we already talked about, Kevin talked about it, I talked about it. It is the extent to which there will be conflict over vaccines. The United States must vaccinate at least 250, 300 million people before they start exporting. China doesn't have to, because China has already shown that they can effectively quarantine, they can effectively surveil. They don't need to give their entire population vaccines. They can start exporting that and use that as leverage. That's gonna matter for Chinese power and the dynamic between the US and China internationally. And then you have something else that we haven't talked about yet, and that's climate. The biggest difference between Trump and Biden in foreign policy, and it's not even close, is climate. Trump was focusing on taking regulations off, supporting coal or trying to, fossil fuels, closely aligned with oil-producing allies like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. Biden is exactly the opposite. His most important appointments have been John Kerry in a new cabinet role and Brian Deese, who ran sustainable investment at BlackRock, going to run the Economic Council. That's a massive shift in U.S. policy, and it will align the Americans with the Japanese on climate to a greater degree, and the Europeans and the Canadians, a lot of Western countries. But with China, I actually think it leads to more competition, because Trump's been ignoring the fact that the Chinese have been working as hard as they can to try to dominate post-carbon energy, nuclear, wind, solar, and electric vehicle supply chain and infrastructure. The Biden administration will not ignore that. That's going to be an area of much greater competition between the US and China, and between the West and China led by the United States. So I don't think it's Cold War. I don't think the countries are about to fall apart, but I think there is a change in trajectory, and the level of competition is going to grow significantly. Hopefully, though, that's going to be the United States with allies, strongly coordinated. And even if we can't rejoin TPP, you're going to see lots of areas where a Biden administration will reach out and want to work with allies like Japan, like Australia, very, very closely.
Ms. Harman, just following up on that point, what kind of role do you expect Japan or Australia or jointly those two countries can play to have the less disruptive world?
Yeah. Well, I have to say Australia is important because Kevin is on the call. And he's in his quarantine beard, and he's brilliant as always. And so, of course, Australia matters. But the whole Quad concept is a good concept. I mean, the U.S. has been AWOL from the region in significant ways other than this kind of noisy press conference, process-free diplomacy in the region, meetings at the highest level. North Korea comes to mind, photo ops that lead to nothing. I would give Trump credit for focus on North Korea and the danger it poses, but then he didn't carry it through. I give him credit for pointing out, and the Obama administration didn't do it robustly enough, the intellectual property theft and other misdeeds of China. So I think those were good initiatives, but then he didn't follow it through. I would say that the pullout of TPP, when we did it, how we did it, was a catastrophic foreign policy failure, not just because that's a trade agreement, but as several people have said, that's the way to set the rules for the neighborhood and to recognize that every member of TPP has China as a larger trading partner than it has the United States. So there was virtue and power in numbers, and now we're out. Maybe we can build back better somehow and rejoin and show up. I mean, let's show up at ASEAN. Let's work on WTO reform. Let's work on WHO reform. These are things the United States can do. So do I know what Biden will do? The headwinds are strong. Both parties have huge anti-trade wings. Bashing China is a blood sport in the United States Congress. I'm very well aware of it, and both parties do it. But Kevin has a very nuanced and I think effective road forward, which I hope not just Australia, but the United States and Japan follow.
Thank you. I'm sorry, our time is running up. Just very quickly, Mr. Rudd, can Australia meet the expectation? And what's happening with Australia-China relations? Very intense looking.
Yeah, I can't be very brief on those questions, but I'll try and say something more generally. The truth is, I'd like to really reinforce Taro's comment before and what Jane has just said. Point one, China understands one reality. It's called the balance of power. China understands power. It understands military power, economic power, and the power of technology. These are the factors which determine China's behavior relative to the power of others, the Americans and its allies. Point two is this, and here is a message for our American friends. Because in the past, you Americans have usually regarded we allies as sometimes useful, often a complete pain to deal with. But that's just life. We understand it, those of us who are students of great powers. But my third point is, for the future, you actually need us. And it's quite a different reality now. You need Japan, you need the Europeans, and you need countries like Australia and the ROK to through a combined power calculus as perceived in Beijing to cause China to conclude that the balance of power is not simply universally moving in its direction. That cannot just be a theoretical proposition. It means, as Taro said before, an absolutely integrated pan-allied strategy between the major Europeans, the major Asian allies, the Canadians, and Washington. It's ultimately, it probably comes down to a group of 7 or 10. And that means their combined military, economic, and technological power is harnessed in a collective strategy for dealing with our Chinese friends. It is only then that China begins to change its operational behavior. Other than that, we are playing with words. And so therefore, for countries like Australia, it is not just working with Japan through innovations such as the Quad. It goes to, frankly, these core countries working like this now with the United States, not theoretically, but practically, to cause China to conclude that it is up against a combined force. And finally, that the precondition for that is that when countries like Australia are, as it were, targeted, as Japan has targeted in the past on rare earths, as the Canadians have been targeted, as the Norwegians have been targeted, as the Swedes have been targeted at different times, we cannot allow there to be a gap between any of us in our collective response to the Chinese when this occurs. And when the rubber hits the road on this, for example, on the punitive economic measures being taken by China against Australia now, which are politically driven tariffs, effectively, in violation of WTO law. When the action is taken in the WTO on this, there must be a pan-allied responsibility for dealing with this. You may recall when the rare earths matter became acute for Japan, Europe, the United States and Japan took a combined action to the WTO. That's the model for the future, not just on trade, not just on the general economy, not just on technology at large, but also on hard questions of foreign policy, national security, and human rights as well. That's where the future lies. And whether you like it or not in Washington, you now need us as much as we need you.
Right. Mr. Kono, in 30 seconds, can Japan play a role that's expected from the world? Are you ready?
Yes, well, we have to do something after Quad. I think we need to seriously consider becoming part of Five Eyes, making Six Eyes, so we can work together with the United States and its closest allies. We are losing leverage in international organization, UN systems. China is putting more candidate to take the leadership in international organization. I think we need to work on how we're going to recreate the governance in international organization. And we really need to sit down and think about how we're going to deal with democracy in Taiwan. I think China is looking at Taiwan after Hong Kong. And as Kevin just said, we cannot make any gap among the collective response to China in this region. So those are the important priorities for Japan, US, and other allies.
Thank you. And Mr. Bremmer, last word from you, please, in 30 seconds.
Last word is that 2021 is going to be more uncertain than any year we've experienced geopolitically, but we actually know what the independent variables that are going to affect it are. 2020 was massively uncertain, but we just didn't realize it at the beginning of the year. So we do have time to plan.
Great. Well, thank you very much for all your insights. We may not be able to hear the audience, but please give a big hand to our excellent speakers. Thank you again very much.
Thank you.